Thanks. I'm doing this book, which is the thinner of the two books, because it's not all of the things that you can do for the poor, which is the thicker of the two books. But it is about giving money to people, and what I'm talking about largely is cash transfers. That's child benefit, non-contributory pensions, family grants, but also guaranteed labor schemes. Now, the subtitle of the book is actually very important because we're calling it the Development Revolution from the Global South. And the point about this is an idea which comes from the South. It's not an idea which comes from the development agencies in DFID. It's not an idea which comes from the World Bank. It comes very much from the South, and it's very much an idea of the last decade. It was first of all a response to the global financial crisis of a decade ago, the Asian financial crisis of the 1990s, in which a number of newly industrializing countries felt they had to provide some kind of social protection because of the impact of that crisis. It was also a recognition at about that time that the neoliberal development model, which was being sold by the international financial institutions, was not working in the South and that you needed something else. And it was also, I think, a psychological reaction to what was seen as northern paternalism. And so it was a southern agenda, a southern challenge to a northern way of thinking. And over the past decade, this idea of giving money to people has developed a huge momentum. Even think about this in a very different way than Southern governments and Southern civil society do. The first and most important thing is that cash transfers are seen as a right, part of the satisfying the right to a decent standard of living that's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this is rights-based, it's not charity. The second thing is that these are seen as long-term grants. These are not safety nets. And sometimes people in discussion, one of the questions will inevitably be, what is the exit strategy? The exit strategy is age-based. Children grow up and exit a child benefit. Old people die and exit a pension scheme. That's the exit strategy. Otherwise, it's long-term, it's permanent. The third thing is that these are broadly based schemes. They're typically targeting 20 or 30 or 40% of a population. They're not aimed at the poorest of the poor. That's partly political, but it's also partly linked to the rights-based sense of how this works. Now, the thinking that has led to this is, first of all, that Southern governments, Southern civil society start by trusting the poor. They don't think the poor are stupid. They don't think the poor are going to misuse the money. They actually start by trusting the poor. And that, of course, is very different from the North as well. And it's based typically on a poverty trap model. The idea that people are trapped in poverty because everything they need to do is harder if you're very poor. If you're selling maize by the tin instead of by the sack, you get less money for it. If you're buying food in small quantities, you're paying more for it than if you're buying by the sack. That if you're traveling to town, it costs more of your income to pay the bus fare. The other thing, of course, is that the risks for the very poor are much higher. that if you make an investment and it fails, your family may starve. So it makes you much more conservative. And one of the things that is kind of the basis of the poverty trap model is the understanding that you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you have no boots. What cash transfers then do are they aim at the same time to deal with both long and short-term poverty. And they deal with short-term poverty because they say, okay, the poor don't have cash. Their biggest problem, poor are poor because they don't have money. And so we give them money, and most of that goes to food. You buy food that raises nutrition, that's for short-term poverty. But the long-term poverty part of this is that the money provides the boots. And these are the boots which allow people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Now, the idea of giving money to people isn't so strange at all. We do it here in Britain. We do child benefit to every child. I get £200 a year because I'm over 65 as a winter fuel payment. Nobody asks me, do I use that money wisely? Nobody asks a mother, does she use the child benefit wisely? We get it as a right. Now, it's not just Britain and it's not just Europe. Probably the biggest cash transfer in the world is in Alaska. Alaska divides up some of the oil revenue among the residents of Alaska. You don't even have to be a citizen. And it's currently running at more than $2,000 a year, goes to every resident of Alaska. And Sarah Palin did not ask one of those people if they used that money wisely. They all got it, whether they drank it or whether they spent it on their kids. Now, so we're used to this in our countries of giving people money. Also, if you look historically, it's very much the basis of European development. Less in the US, but much the basis of European development. Pensions and social protection came before economic growth. And one of the reasons was that pensions, for instance, reduce the risk. Reduce the risk that you're going to be left alone with no money, with no kids. So it allowed people to have fewer children. Social benefits increase labor mobility. These are things which create economic growth. So that what happened in Europe in general is that we didn't wait for economic growth to generate money to do social transfers. We did social transfers to create economic growth. Now, what happened through the 70s and 80s is the international financial institution said to the South, yes, but this shouldn't work. It really shouldn't work. You have to create growth first so there can be social transfers. Now, what we are seeing as a Southern-generated program of cash transfers is that the South is actually looking to European history and other history and saying, wait a minute, we're going to do what the North did because it worked. Now, there are all sorts of reasons that you have to do it differently. Northern social protection tended to be job-based or at least trade-based. It tended to be male-based. What you're seeing in the South is you have much more of an informal sector, so you can't go through structured employment schemes, employment insurance. All of our understandings of gender mean that you don't want a system which is based on men, so that cash transfers become the Southern modification, if you like, of what we already did in Europe a century ago. Now, what we're seeing then is that cash transfers have been designed differently in different countries. But one of the things that was interesting about writing this book is that in the North, we really don't believe that poor people are going to use money wisely. So this has been incredibly well studied. Every time the World Bank or DFID or somebody else does a study and it shows that the poor use money wisely, the consultants are told, no, that's the wrong answer, do it again. And we get another study and the poor use the money wisely. And so to write this thin book, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies, all on cash transfers. I'm just out of this, it's only a decade old, this idea, and yet it's incredibly well studied. And what these studies show consistently is that cash in hand, money, empowers people. They can use that money for themselves, for their families, and they choose how to use it. And what is fascinating is that they choose to use it wisely, pretty much generally. Not everybody. A few people will drink it, a few people will waste it. But by and large, the money is used very wisely. One of the things that's fascinating is how much children gain independent of what the cash transfer is. Cash transfers tend to go into the family budget. So whether it's a child benefit or whether it's a pension, it goes into the family budget. So that children tend to be the biggest gainers from pensions, for example. What you see is that pretty much across the board, half of a cash transfer is spent on food. Typically, not more food, but better quality food, more nutritional food, more varied food. This tends to raise the nutritional level, particularly of kids, but also of the family as a whole. This, in turn, means more kids can go to school. It means they perform better in school. So that immediate money that's being spent on food is really important. But that, in turn, already starts a positive spiral. Because where do you buy food? Well, you tend to buy it in the village. You tend to buy it in town. You tend to buy it locally. So that stimulates the local economy. So we're already starting to create a positive economic spiral, which is independent of the poverty reduction. But perhaps the most important thing of all, at least for me, is the way in which cash transfers promote development. And all of the studies show that some of the money is invested. It's invested in either in fertilizer or better seed. It's invested in things you can trade. Or it's invested in promoting job seeking. So that, particularly migrant labor, so that what you do is you do see, for instance, more Mexicans going over the border to the United States to look for work because their family is secure at home and they can take the risk going over the border to the U.S. What you see in South Africa is more migrants, more women particularly, going into the cities to look for work because there is money that will take care of their kids. Their kids are secure. They don't have to worry about day-to-day survival of their family. They can travel to look for work. And what you see in the studies that have looked in this is that, in general, families with cash transfers after 5 years have an income which has increased more than by the value of the cash transfer, because they are finding they're using some of that money to invest in income generation, job creation, looking for work. Now, one of the things that struck me really strongly when I was looking at this whole area is that we found 45 countries that are doing cash transfers. Every one of them is different. There isn't a single model. There are all sorts of mixes. There's child benefit, there's pension, there's family grants. One of the things we included in this is guaranteed labor schemes. Ethiopia and India, for instance, both guarantee work. India has this program of guaranteeing 100 days labor a year per family. The reason we count that as a cash transfer is it's a right. It's a guarantee. If you are an Indian family, you have a right to 100 days work a year. You can depend on it. You have to get it within a week. And if there isn't any work, they have to pay you anyway. So that it's something that you can budget for. It's something you can plan for. And it's rights-based. Now, what you see in all of these programs is an amazing mix. Some are conditional, some are non-conditional. Some are narrowly targeted, some are broadly targeted, some mix several programs. All of them have a social protection component and a developmental component, but the balance is different in every one of them. What is interesting about all of these is they come from countries that could pay for them themselves, either through taxes, so that your starting countries are Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, that could actually pay out of current revenue. The next generation is tending to come from countries that could pay out of mineral revenue. So you see Mongolia and Ghana setting up programs that they are going to pay for out of mineral revenues. So these are countries which are doing this on their own money. The other thing that you're seeing now is a lot of South-South cooperation. Brazil is advising Ghana on its program. Mexico is working with Indonesia on its program. You're seeing a lot of the South-South cooperation. But the final comment to be made on this is fine so long as you can pay for it. But for the poorest countries in Africa, it's going to have to come out of aid money. And the question that I think remains in the air is, how do you incorporate aid? Because one of the problems is there isn't a set of rules that donors can impose. There isn't a model that donors can impose. And indeed, donor-led programs have actually done rather badly. And all that we could do with the book was come up with 5 very broad guidelines. Every country has got to generate its program itself. It has to balance its goals. It has to look at the local history and politics and come up with a program. And what we find is that there seem to be 5 general rules. That the program has to be seen by the people in the country to be fair. It doesn't work if some people get money and their neighbors say, I'm just as poor, I should be getting money too. The program has to be assured in that you have to be sure you're going to get this money every month and you can plan for it. The amount of money doesn't need to be large, but it does need to be large enough to make a difference. So it has to affect the family budget. So if the grant is large enough to send one kid to school but not the other kids to school, it's not going to work. If it's large enough that a family feels it can send all of its kids to school, then it will work. The 4th point is it has to be practical. Now, this really varies from country to country, so that you look at a country like Mexico, which has a well-established civil service. They do quite a complicated means test. You look at African countries which don't have as good a civil service, you can't begin to do that. So whatever system you do has to be practical within the country. The final point is it has to be popular. And that's politically popular. Because most of these countries are in electoral democracies of one sort or another. You don't want a program which is identified with a political party. You want a program which will carry across into the next government. Mexico, for instance, which had a change of government a few years back, not only couldn't cancel the cash transfer program, even though it had been identified with the PRI, but indeed they felt they had to expand it. And what you're starting to see now is these programs have been around long enough that the ones that are not broadly popular tend to get replaced by the new government. The ones that are broadly popular are entrenched. They stick. Now, one of the things about being broadly popular is they do have to be broadly based. Now, if they are going to the poorest of the poor, if they are heavily conditional and say, okay, we're forcing the poor to do things, the middle class says it's not for us. One of the things interesting about child benefit in Britain, and we're having this debate now, is the middle class accepts child benefit because they get it. Now, that seems to be true of these programs in general. The middle class ought to think that this is a program which could apply to them if they lost their job, for example, or if they had a bad crop or whatever. It isn't something that's for somebody else. And that means that it can't be for the poorest of the poor. It has to be broadly based. The political popularity is based on local history, is based on local politics. And that's one of the reasons the successful programs are also different, is because it is generated by the local politics. Final comment is that when these 5 rules seem to be followed, cash transfers really work. They reduce immediate poverty, and they do promote development. Thank you.